Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be doing an AM4 motherboard highlights kind of thing. So basically, I've built a list of AM4 motherboards that I think are good. I've pulled the prices for them from Newegg. There's sales going on right now, so the prices aren't like, if you see this video in like, maybe a week, the prices may not be very accurate anymore, but yeah, basically, here's a list of motherboards that I think are good in some way, shape, or form. So if you're looking for an AM4 motherboard, these are motherboards I think you should consider. And we're going to start at the high end, and then we're going to work our way down with some, subcategories along the way as well.
Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the Just Buy It code. Unlike real-time ray tracing, our merch actually exists. To commemorate the most memorable quote of the year, and also Black Friday, but mostly the first thing, everything in the GN store is 10% off with the discount code JUSTBUYIT at checkout. That includes our most popular item, the critically acclaimed GN Mod Mat, our shirts, ceramic coffee mugs, and GPU component posters, and everything else. As a bonus, this is also a great way to support GN's work. The code lasts through November 26th. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or click the link below.
So in the top end, if you like tweaking things, if you like BCLK overclocking, if you want to mess with Precision Boost Overdrive, and if you want to buy a 2700X, I'm going to point you towards the X470 Aorus Gaming 7 Wi-Fi. And the reasoning for this is very simple. Gigabyte's implementation of BCLK overclocking technically violates AMD's specifications for how BCLK overclocking is supposed to work. But since AMD's specifications are, in my opinion, completely bloody stupid, similar to how AMD broke HBM overclocking on Fury cards, which, again, that's AMD spec, I still think AMD spec is dumb. The thing is that ultimately, BCLK overclocking on Gigabyte motherboards works better than on every other motherboard I've tested so far. And the reasoning is very simple. You change the BCLK, and the CPU acts like the BCLK hasn't changed. So you get a bump in performance, but you don't run into any issues. Whereas on like ASUS motherboards and ASRock motherboards and MSI motherboards, if you bump up the BCLK, the CPU will just get locked at base clock. And I think ASUS has workarounds to get around that. But those workarounds are way, way, way clunkier than Gigabyte's implementation of just not doing any. Like, it just doesn't do it. You just raise the BCLK and the motherboard acts like nothing changed, which is much, much more convenient as far as I'm concerned. Now, it is worth noting that this feature is super niche as far as I'm concerned, because basically, if you're going to be overclocking with the BCLK, you need to keep in mind that it can cause M.2 SSD corruptions. It can cause incompatibility with GPUs and all kinds of other issues, because when you're overclocking with the BCLK, everything gets overclocked. And the benefits to it is you're going to get slightly more single core boost and slightly more multi-core boost as well. Because the whole idea behind BCLK overclocking is that you basically take, like, the way I'd do a BCLK overclock for a 2700X for a X470 Aorus Gaming 7 is basically I'd go into the BIOS, I'd go into the Precision Boost Overdrive settings, I'd max out all of the current and power limits, then I would raise the BCLK and then tweak the core voltage offset up or down until I get stability. The thing is, at best, after you do all of this, and initially this sounds really simple, after you do all of this, at best, you're probably going to get about 5% more performance, because that's roughly the clock speed increase you get from raising the BCLK to 105 megahertz instead of the stock 100 megahertz, right? And it's really not like you're going to hit 110 megahertz, especially considering that the PCIe 3.0 breaks completely at around 107. So do keep that in mind. Like, there's the performance gains are very, very limited, and it causes all kinds of stability issues. As I mentioned, the M.2 SSDs and, some GPUs not playing well with it. But the other issue it tends to cause is that you need to stress test your CPU's stability on single core, dual core, quad core, 6 core, and 8 core workloads, because you're essentially changing the boost speed for all of these different configurations at the same time, and you need to revalidate that in all of these workloads it's still stable, because you can run into situations where, okay, your all core boost is completely stable, but at 4 core workloads you're getting let's say 4.25 gigahertz, and the voltage is too low to actually sustain that 4.25 gigahertz clock speed, and the CPU crashes. I had a CPU that behaved like that, which is why I'm pointing this out. So Ultimately, while, BCLK overclocking with Precision Boost Overdrive can help you eke out every last percentage point of performance out of your CPU, at the same time, it's really tedious. And ultimately, what you're going to, like, the primary concerns with PBO, I think, are just having negative voltage offset, because at least that's not nearly as difficult to fine-tune. Basically, if you run like a minus 100 or a minus 50 millivolt offset, you get a bit more boost because the CPU isn't so thermally constrained, and it's not such a big voltage drop that it actually causes any issues. Once you start playing with the BCLK, you may find that you need even the stock voltages that the PBO applies, which are insanely high, mind you. You might actually need those voltages to just run stably at all. And overall, it's just like messing with the BCLK, in my opinion, not really worth it. But if you are going to mess with it, this motherboard does it the best. At the same time, you get a really good VRM heatsink and a really solid 10-phase V-Core VRM using 40 amp power stages from International Rectifier. And just really, this is a solid motherboard if you want to mess with that kind of thing. So that's why it gets gets onto the high-end portion of my list of motherboards worth considering. Now then, it also costs $230. Now then, moving on to the other high-end candidate, we have the X470 Taichi Ultimate. This does not have the great great AMD spec violating BCLK overclocking implementation that the Gigabyte motherboard has. Now, this has the main reason this got here is because it has Quantia 10 gig LAN. Which I think, if you want a 10 gig network controller, this is the only board you can get. So that is, that's pretty neat. You actually get a better V-Core VRM, so you get a 12-phase, but the heat sinks are not so great. However, it is worth noting that the VRM here is so freaking overkill that you don't actually really need a heatsink in the first place anyway, so the fact that the heatsink is more a work of art than an actual heatsink doesn't actually negatively affect the VRM in any way, shape, or form. The board does have working negative core voltage offsets, and it does have working precision boost overdrive, so you can still, achieve the same you can achieve all of the same performance as you would with the Gaming 7 if you just didn't bother with the BCLK overclock. Which, again, if you're planning to run M.2 SSDs, I would strongly recommend that you just don't mess with the BCLK, because I have heard at least one horror story of an M.2 SSD just getting completely bricked afterwards. So yeah, and overall, at the same time, it causes issues like the M.2 SSD is just not getting detected a lot of the time. So if you don't want to mess with BCLK overclocking and you just want want to just run precision boost overdrive and then a negative voltage offset, this is going to be a really good choice for that, because it does do all of those things, and you get the 10 gig LAN. Of course, the Gigabyte motherboard does it too, and in this case, this board is $250, whereas this is $230. So you do save a bit of money if you go with the Gaming 7 here. Now then, this motherboard doesn't actually make it onto the list of motherboards I think you should consider, but I will give it an honorable mention. And the reason why it's getting an honorable mention is because I have one of these. I like it a lot as an extreme overclocking motherboard. I think on liquid nitrogen, this motherboard is absolutely amazing. It has a great, the V-Core VRM on this thing is the best V-Core VRM you can get on X470. It's a 10-phase, because at the time ASUS still knew what a doubler was. You have a 10-phase, 60 amp power stages, just absolutely amazing VRM, and it doesn't really do anything other than that. The problem is, on ambient cooling, it basically, it overclocks basically the same as the Taichi or the Gaming 7. So I don't really see a good, that's why it's getting an honorable mention, because this thing is $255. And I don't think most people buying this thing will actually run it on liquid nitrogen. And if you're not going to run it on liquid nitrogen, this is kind of like buying a rally car to go shopping in it. Technically, you can technically fit shopping bags in a rally car, but there's no AC. It's really expensive. It's not very comfortable, and just overall, there's no real reason I would get this motherboard for a daily system, right? This does everything, this does literally everything you could want on ambient cooling that this does, and this does more than what this does. And this is even cheaper, $230. So, great extreme overclocking motherboard, but just I don't think it's worth it for a daily system. It just doesn't make sense. Like, I wouldn't put this in a daily system. It's just really, really expensive, and it doesn't do anything that makes much of a difference in a daily scenario. So yeah, that's why it gets the honorable mention, but I wouldn't actually buy this motherboard for like a daily build. Just unfortunately just doesn't do anything all that special, and it costs a lot. So then, now we get into the $180 price category with a whole bunch of motherboards at $180. Now, there's the X470 Taichi, which, you know how I like this VRM? Great VRM. Yeah, you get that same great VRM. You don't get the 10 gig LAN, unfortunately. They've also decided to remove the two, like the power and the reset button. You do still have the postcode, which is actually kind of a killer feature at this price point, because this has troubleshooting LEDs, and this has 4 LEDs for troubleshooting. This also has 4 LEDs for troubleshooting. This has a postcode. If there's something wrong, this is much easier to understand than, 4 LEDs telling you roughly that, oh, there's something wrong with the RAM, there's something wrong with the GPU, there's something wrong with the CPU. Well, this gives you much more detail because it has the postcode, so much more useful. Also, it has a better VRM than the other two motherboards in this price category that are worth considering, and it still has, it has the negative voltage offset, it has precision boost overdrive overclocking support. If you're going to stick a 2700X into a $180 motherboard, as of right now, this is probably the best choice, mostly because this is on a pretty deep discount right now. At least at the time that I was writing up the script. So yeah, for $180, I really like this. Like, this is a really solid choice of a motherboard, right? Especially considering the competition it has. Now then, the next motherboard in this category, the ROG Strix X470-F Gaming. So this has a 6 plus 4-phase VRM using 60 amp power stages, so pretty significantly weaker than what you get on this motherboard. However, at the same time, more than enough to run a 2700X. It's still not going to overheat or anything like that, especially because this has some reasonably substantial heat sinks. Like, they're not great heat sinks, but they're still a lot better than what ASUS puts on a lot of their other motherboards, which isn't really saying a whole lot because ASUS tends to put terrible heat sinks on most of their boards, but this is a lot better than like a lot of the other boards they make. And so you do have negative voltage offset, you have precision boost overdrive overclocking working. It does technically have BCLK. It has all the same issues the Crosshair 7 Hero has. If you're going to put a 2700X in something, this is also a solid option, but it's just like, yeah, I don't see a reason to pick this up over a Taichi as long as the Taichi is at the same price point as this is. Well, actually, the Taichi is currently cheaper, as this is $185, but nonetheless, very solid motherboard, and honestly, kind of interchangeable in my eyes with the Taichi. Like, pick your poison. Taichi's VRM is technically better. I don't think you're actually going to notice a difference. Taichi does also have the postcode. I actually like the postcode a lot. I would probably go for the postcode here. But, yeah, either of these boards, they're pretty interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. Both have this has a good VRM, this has a better VRM, but both are good enough for, anything you'd really want to do. And BIOS-wise, they don't really differ in features all that much either. Now, this gets an honorable mention. This doesn't really deserve to be considered that much because this doesn't have negative core voltage offset. So you can't actually, one of the core issues with Precision Boost Overdrive is that AMD's Precision Boost Overdrive likes to use way more voltage than is necessary. Like, if you max out Precision Boost Overdrive at 4.35 gigahertz, you're likely to see voltages of like 1.5 volts, which doesn't actually help anything. Because normally the CPU hits 4.35 gigahertz anyway, and it does it with about 50 millivolts less, or even 100 millivolts less in some cases. So, with like the ASUS motherboards, the ASRock motherboards, and the Gigabyte motherboards, when you max out Precision Boost Overdrive, the first thing you do is you also set like a negative 50 millivolt or a negative 100 millivolt core voltage offset. MSI doesn't have this functionality in their BIOS at all. So while this motherboard has a plenty solid 5-phase VRM, in fact, I was really impressed by this 5-phase VRM in my testing. If you're going to buy a 2700X or a 2600X, this motherboard is going to actually limit you on overclocking with Precision Boost Overdrive. Now, if you just want to set up a static all-core overclock, this thing is great, and quite frankly, interchangeable with the other two boards in this price category. So if you're on like a Ryzen 7 2700, it's basically choose a feature, like you're basically going to be choosing one of these three motherboards on a feature you like or the way it looks, or like the postcode, right? Like they're overclocking wise, these three boards pretty much interchangeable. So you're going to have to find something, static overclocking. Obviously, if you're doing precision boost overdrive, this isn't going to work as well as the other two. But if you're going to run a 2700, considering how cheap the 2700s are currently, might be probably a better choice than a 2700X. These are interchangeable. For static overclocking, these are really interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that's the $180 price point. Now let's go to $140. Now here we have the X470 Aorus Ultra Gaming. This is a motherboard I would straight up not put anywhere near a 2700X because let's say you have a room, let's say you live somewhere where the summer hits, say, 35 degrees Celsius or even 30. This VRM is going to overheat. Guaranteed it's going to overheat if you're actually pushing a 2700X on this board. Also, the VRM is just really not that great, and I'm pretty sure when I was testing with this motherboard, it was actually limiting how much precision boost overclocking I was able to do with it. So with the 2700, like the 2700X is just too power hungry for the VRM on this board, because this is just like, it looks like an 8+3 phase, and Gigabyte is still marketing it as an 8+3 phase. It's a 4+3 though. I'm pretty sure I made a pretty long video about how they need to stop. Well, whatever. It's a 4+3 phase. I guess they changed the other boards, just didn't bother with this one then. It's interesting. Must have missed that. Anyway, it's a 4+3 phase VRM. It's really not a good fit for a 2700X. If you want to max out, but if you want to mess with BCLK overclocking on a 2600X, this is a really good option because this is the cheapest board from Gigabyte with BCLK overclocking. So, yeah, that's like the one scenario where this motherboard makes some amount of sense, but it's not really practical. It's a $140 motherboard for a 6-core 27. Like the 2600X is just not exactly a good value CPU, and then this motherboard's kind of expensive, so that even further lessens the overall value you'd be getting out of your build. So yeah, just like, this is an interesting motherboard to mess with. It's not actually a very good, but as far as being a good motherboard goes, it's not a good motherboard. Just has some interesting features that might be worth considering if you have some niche requirements. But so that's why I'm considering this like an honorable mention again, because yeah, I wouldn't put an 8-core on it, and it's too expensive for a 6-core really. So then, what would I put an 8-core in? Well, there's this thing. This is borderline capable. This is borderline able to run a 2700X at 1.4 volts or all core. And so, if you wanted to do a static 2700 overclock, this is great. But the issue is MSI makes a whole bunch of B450 boards that have this exact same VRM, or a very similar VRM, and more substantial heatsinks. So unless you desperately need the X470 chipset for some reason, I'm not sure what that reason may be, but there might be some feature on this motherboard you want. The VRM on this is solid enough, but the thing is, you can get this same VRM at the same price point. This board's $140. You can get this board for $140. You get the same 4+2 phase VRM. It looks like an 8 phase. It's a 4+2 phase. They're putting a whole bunch of components in parallel. So this 4+2 phase and this 4+2 phase are exactly the same. This one has a bigger heatsink. But this is a B450 board. I think this board also comes with Wi-Fi and things. So there's this is a better featured board, but it's B450, whereas this is an X470 motherboard and it's a bit more barren. But the VRM between them is the same, and this one has better VRM cooling. So this is kind of a case if you can't think of a reason why you need the X470 chipset, get this for your 2700. This is going to work perfectly well as well. Now, what if you want to go even cheaper on your motherboard? Well, this works. You still have a substantial heatsink. The VRM got a little bit downgraded at this point, but it's still roughly the same VRM as here. The heatsink's just a bit smaller. So ultimately, this will still probably have better VRM thermals than the X470 Gaming Plus, just because the heatsink is so much more substantial here. And that's also why this has gotten on the list. But keep in mind, all the MSI motherboards lack negative core voltage offsets. So if you're going to be, you're best going to be these are great at maxing out a 2700, like overclocking a 2700. I think for maxing out a 2700, you'd probably want this board just because the extra phases might actually help with your overclocking range, and or this or that. But and I'm not talking power delivery capability. I mean the output power, like the output voltage ripple of this 5-phase or this 6-phase or this 12-phase is just going to be quite a bit lower than what you get on these 4-phase designs. But nonetheless, this is like one of the best 4-phase VRMs on the entire X470, like on the entire AM4 platform. So this is a solid VRM, and you should get a good overclock out of a 2700. You can still precision boost overdrive, overclock your 2700X as well. You're just not gonna, be able to minimize the voltages that it runs at, and that's kind of true for all of the MSI motherboards. So yeah, as well as this one. But for a 2700 or a 2600, this is like a great fit. In fact, for a 2600, that VRM is probably kind of like that VRM's cooling is kind of overkill. The 4-phase, I'd say, is kind of a requirement for even a 6-core. Now, what if you want an MATX motherboard? Well, unfortunately, it's more MSI. Here's the thing. MSI currently has they're running the worst MOSFET they have on the out of the motherboards I've gone through so far. The B450M mortar here has the worst MOSFET out of the MSI boards. This uses a 3 milliohm RDS on MOSFET. For comparison, Gigabyte typically, like their low side MOSFET is typically 4 milliohms RDS on, which translates to roughly 33% more heat from the low side MOSFETs on Gigabyte in Gigabyte's VRM. So MSI just absolutely sweeps the competition when it comes to VRM component quality, and then they also have these massive heat sinks on all of them, which is why we're, if you're going to go MATX, I'm going to point you to the mortar. If you're going to be running like a 2700, 2600, 2600X, or even 2700X, right? Because ultimately, there's not really an MATX motherboard from anybody where it's like, yeah, sure, they have the negative voltage offset, but those motherboards have VRMs so bad that even with a minus 100 millivolts offset on the CPU, that VRM is likely to overheat if you run a long multi-core workload. And I've tested that. I've actually had a board do that already in my testing. So yeah, basically, if you're going to be going MATX, this is the only motherboard I would recommend for running an 8-core or a 6-core, really. So that's that. What if you want an 8? And this thing comes in at just $80. So, this is also pretty cheap. So that's kind of neat. And yeah, MSI is just basically MSI is on all of these MSI boards are on this list because MSI has just used better MOSFETs than everybody else. And then they figured out, hey, if we just use a bigger slab of aluminum than everybody else, our VRM is going to run is going to run even cooler. Because again, MSI's VRM is a tad more efficient than everybody else's right now. So yeah, that's why all of these MSI boards got onto the list. Now, in Mini-ITX land, MSI has the B450i Gaming Plus AC. And the reason why I'm putting it on the list is because this VRM right here is actually really solid. This is a 6-phase using 60 amp power stages. So you basically get the same VRM that you would get on the Strix right here. Of course, the heatsink on this thing is much smaller. It's an ITX board. But if you're going to be, running an 8-core, in an ITX setup, your VRM is just going to your VRM is just going to suffer. That's just what it's going to be, because there's not a lot of space to put a heatsink or a very large VRM, or even to spread the VRM over a large, segment of PCB, because you can just lower the thermal density doing that a bit. Well, you can't do any of that. And so for that reason, the B450i Gaming Plus AC from MSI is my pick for best ITX motherboard. And the cool thing is it also only comes in at around $120. You also get two 60 amp power stages for your SoC VRM. However, I would not actually recommend this motherboard for running APUs. MSI's APU overclocking support in their BIOS is just kind of terrible. So yeah, that's just basically the best way to summarize the MSI AM4 motherboard lineup is to say, most of them are really great in the VRM department, right? This absolutely is the best VRM on ITX you can get. At this price point, there isn't a motherboard with a better VRM. Similar for this one and this one. At these price points, these just hands down have the best VRMs. But MSI's BIOS is kind of lacking when it comes to things like offset voltage, BCLK, APU overclocking support is just not great. And so for that reason, if you're going to be looking at APUs, I'm going to point you towards this. If you're going to do an ITX APU build, I'm going to point you towards this. And the reason why is simple. You get a 4+ 2-phase VRM using 50 amp power stages from an international rectifier. And unlike on MSI's motherboard, Gigabyte's kind of clunky, but, you know, once you learn the Gigabyte BIOS, it's pretty quick to get around. Gigabyte's BIOS actually has all of the features. They're just a bit difficult to find. And all of the features also work. So yeah, if you're going to be overclocking an APU like a 2400G or a 2200G, this is going to serve you great. And, you know, the weaker VRM being a 4+ 2 phase here isn't a real concern because the APUs really don't pull that much. Like, they're just a quad core, right, with hyper-threading at most. They really don't pull that much V-core power. And the iGPU does actually pull a pretty significant amount of power once you start overclocking the memory and just overclocking everything, really. But ultimately, the two phases for SoC power on this motherboard are still going to be able to handle that just fine. So that's why, you know, if you're going to be doing an APU ITX build, this would be my motherboard of choice for that, just because this has the best balance of like features and VR, like BIOS, BIOS support and VRM components right there. So then, what if you want a ATX or MATX APU build? Well, I'm going to point you towards ASUS because, again, and I'm going to point you towards this. And the reason why I'm going to point you towards this board is it has an SoC VRM heatsink. Now, don't be fooled. This may look like it's a 8+ 2-phase VRM. It's still a 4-phase. It's the same 4-phase ASUS has on all of their motherboards, all of their other cheap motherboards. But at the very least, they've upgraded the VRM heatsinks. And again, the APUs really don't pull that much power. So you're not going to need to worry about the main concern there is just getting the VRM heatsinks. And ASUS has great APU overclocking support. I have an ASUS motherboard here that I'm only really holding on to because it's so good at APU overclocking compared to all the other boards. So yeah, the reason why I wouldn't recommend an ASUS ITX motherboard for APU overclocking is because they have a single-phase SoC VRM, which is just not enough as far as I'm concerned. Like, you should have at least 2 phases for the SoC, which ASUS doesn't have on their ITX board. But on their MATX and their ATX boards, the TUF B450 Pro series, this is like a new lineup of TUF boards that they're doing. They've upgraded the VRM cooling. The VRM under the heatsinks is still the same, but the APU support is great. So, and unfortunately, these motherboards are for pre-order currently only, and I think this MATX one might be somewhere around $90. I'm not sure about the full ATX one. I'm going to guess it's also going to be about $90. So, yeah, that is all of the AM4 motherboards, and that's all of the AM4 motherboards I consider worth considering. Most motherboards that I didn't address here, I just think are straight up terrible in some way, shape, or form. It's anything from just VRM is awful, which is true for quite a few of the ASRock ones, as well as the ASUS ones and the Gigabyte ones. Really, everything that isn't MSI, they're terrible. A lot of those are just awful. Yeah, especially like at the lower price points, it's just like that's kind of the case across the board. But and in some cases, you know, it's a case of like, oh, the BIOS is missing certain features, or memory overclocking just doesn't work very well. But the boards I've just gone through, these are all boards I consider I feel like all of these have a niche that they're actually good at. There's a lot of other boards out there where it's just like, why would you even get it? So yeah, that is the highlights list of AM4 motherboards for me. And thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. If you'd like to support Gamers Nexus, there's the Patreon, as well as store.gamersnexus.net. Did I screw that up? I think I screwed that up. Anyway, there's links to all of that down in the description below, as well as probably in the comments. And if you'd like to check out more of my content, because I have a channel called actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do a lot more overclocking related content. So that'd be cool as well. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.